And welcome to all of you. Just to sort of do the full disclosure, since Aspen is always a complex web, I've worked for then Commissioner Kate Levin, and she currently works for one of the foundations that's a partner to ArtPlace. Our organization has made 2 grants to Springboard for the Arts, which is Laura's organization. Dennis Scholl is a longtime friend and colleague who's also at one of the foundations, the Knight Foundation that funds ArtPlace, and we don't know how Eric showed up on this panel.
I'm waiting for a grant, man.
I think it's because, as near as I can tell, you're sort of the James Brown of Aspen. You're the hardest working man here. I've seen you on more panels, on more bicycles, and all of that. So we're going to have a conversation a little bit about community. And what's interesting to me when we were prepping for this panel is everyone sort of started with the same question, which is, can we actually have a conversation about what we mean by community? Because different people use it in different ways. And as I was leaving Washington, D.C. to move back to New York to make Aliyah for me, there was a guy called Andy Shalal who was running for mayor of Washington, D.C., fabulous poet and entrepreneur. And he didn't make it through the primary, and he posted on Facebook some lessons that he learned while he was running for mayor. And one of the ones that I thought was most interesting is he posited that black people use the word community, white people use the word neighborhood. And so I thought about that a little bit and some of the things that we mean by community, and maybe we use it as a proxy for other things. So I've been sort of asking people about this community question as we've been prepping for this panel. And it was actually at a wonderful dinner last night when I was standing with Paola Antonelli. And I said, Paola, what do you mean by community? And she said, well, I just use that definition of the group of people whose happiness makes you happy. And I think that's a pretty good definition. My community are the people who, when they're happy, I'm happy. So if I do something to increase their happiness, I do something to increase mine.
It's actually Aristotle.
Well, yes. But it sounds better in an Italian accent than it does in the Greek accent.
Is that Paola Aristotle? Is that
Paola,
she's correcting her name?
Right, I call her Aristotle. And so it is both a Greek and an Italian definition. And now it is an Aspen definition as well. And so I turned back to a book that I'd been reading at a friend's suggestion, which is called The Happy City by Charles Montgomery. And in it, he talks a lot about the mayor of Bogota and the real switch that happened. So I'm going to just read you a quick paragraph from that book, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So when Peñalosa ran for the mayor's seat back in 1997, oops, hold on for a second, he refused to make the promises doled out by so many politicians. He was not going to make everyone richer, forget the dream of becoming as wealthy as Americans. It would take generations to catch up to the gringos, even if the urban economy caught fire and burned blue for a century. The dream of riches, Peñalosa complained, served only to make Bogotans feel bad. Quote, if we defined our success just in terms of income per capita, we would have to accept ourselves as second or third-rate societies, as a bunch of losers. No, the city needed a new goal. His promise was simple. He was going to make Bogotans happier. And what are our needs for happiness, he asked? We need to walk, just as birds need to fly. We need to be around other people. We need beauty. We need contact with nature. And most of all, we need not to be excluded. We need to feel some sort of equality. So one of the things I would posit for this panel is that we're going to talk about sort of successful communities, and I would ask that we focus on some of the things other than income. We've had a lot of sort of income economic panels, and let's talk about some of the other things. And so, Dennis, let me just ask you to speak briefly first about the soul of the community work, which is something you've talked a lot about and sort of goes along with Peñalosa's formulation.
So the Knight Foundation came out of the largest newspaper chain in America. The brothers put their fortune into the foundation, and they work on really 2 things. They work on building the communities that they made their fortunes in, and we're the largest journalism funders in the world, which I've learned the hard way. It means words really matter there. You have to be very careful at the Knight Foundation. No, yeah. I don't shoot from the hip ever, yeah. And so we asked 43,000 people about 6 years ago in the 26 Knight communities. We said, what attaches you to your community? What makes you want to be there? What binds you to your community? Gave them 17 choices. Are there any politicians in the world in the room? I know, Ann, I'm sorry, you're going to hate this, but the 17th most favored thing, the very last thing that bound them to their community, were the words civic engagement. We asked people and they said, we don't care about civic engagement. Fix the potholes, leave us alone. The number one thing that bound them to their communities was social offerings, primarily arts and culture. A second, just for those of you that are following, were the aesthetics, you know, how nice a place is it that you live? And the third was openness, a sense of how people treated each other, you know, in an open way. But the number one thing was social offerings, primarily arts and culture. We said, well, that can't be right. So we did it a second year, identical results. I said at that point, that can't be right. It's, you know, I was in my Clinton, it's the economy stupid mode at that point. But what you find out is that that's what people care about in their community. That's what binds them, is the opportunities that they have to participate and to obtain joy, if you will. And so that has really driven the entire arts program that we've been working on for a very long time. And it's called The Soul of the Community. It's at soulofthecommunity.com. And it's profound. The other thing that comes out of that is we started to, when I introduced your other panel the other day, we started to ask the question, well, how are people deciding where to go as opposed to whether they're attached where they are? And the millennial generation in particular, they choose where to go first based upon the amenities, then they decide how they're going to make a living. And those are two profound changes in our society, and all of them point toward arts and culture as a way of building a vibrant community, an exciting community, a community that kind of has that mojo that you're always looking for when you're on the road. So
let me ask you just to dive into a specific example, because I think one of the myths or assumptions that's not correct when we talk about community is that it's a static, durable thing, right? We talk about the community needs this, the community was that. So we all know that communities can't change. And we know that's true because you moved to Miami in what year?
63?
And the Miami of 1963 and the Miami of 2014 are identical, correct?
Yeah. It's a little frightening, actually, what's happened.
So will you just talk a little bit about what change you've seen, and was it a mayor who made it so? Was it a developer who made it so? Was it arts and culture offerings? What is this sort of, what happened to Miami?
Well, you know, we have pretty much recently taken to calling it the Miami Miracle. And I say that as somebody who has labored in obscurity culturally in Miami for the last 35 or 40 years. Deborah and I have been banging away down there. And suddenly we're kind of getting our 15 minutes, and we're kind of enjoying it, frankly, to be blunt about it. But within the context of the city, there's a part of it is a maturity process. Part of it is asking the city what it wants as opposed to telling it what it's going to get. And I think that's a big thing that we try to do at the foundation a lot. We reach out to the community and invite everybody to participate and ask the question, what is it that you'd like to see more of? And in our community just recently, it's been about contemporary dance for some reason. We did not have a big dance community. We have a wonderful ballet company. But the community as a whole has begun to kind of rally around that. And of course, you know, you all work in communities. You see the little green shoots that happen sometimes, and when you get a critical mass of those, you know, you have like a nodal point. In our case, it's an area called the Wynwood Arts District. Before that, in the 80s, you know, we were very early involved in the Art Deco district on Miami Beach, and once again, it wasn't what it is today then. It was frightening and difficult, and so you have to kind of follow the audience. And of course, we've done well by doing good by artists. You know, we have followed the artists in our community as they've traveled, and you can never go wrong doing that, frankly.
I think that's great. And let me use that as a pivot to move over to Laura, not surprisingly. One of the other things that we know to be true, because every time we have the conversation we say the same thing, which is that artists don't live anywhere. Right? Artists are just people who move to a community. We always talk about there's a problem in this community, we need artists to move there. So artists we know are aliens who sort of are beamed down on Earth. You, I think, as an organization, might have a slightly different take than that conventional wisdom. So will you say a word about sort of who your organization is, and then talk about some of the work you've been doing?
Right. So I work for an organization called Springboard for the Arts. It's based in Minnesota, both in the urban and rural area of Minnesota. And we work primarily in a really place-based way. So for us, community, that definition is really place-based, neighborhood-based. And then we also share ideas nationally with other communities that are also place-based. And I think, I think what you said is exactly right. People sort of other the artist, and we think of them as this magical sort of unicorn-like being that lives someplace else. And that certainly isn't the person that lives next door to me, or certainly isn't me. Right. I mean, even in the arts, I hear people say all the time, oh, I'm not an artist. And usually if you probe that a little bit, you find that they do have some creative practice. And so I think for us, we have a very broad definition of who is an artist, and in fact, see it as part of our work and as part of our mission to get more people to self-identify as artists, because communities need creative thinking. Communities need access to artists, but I think that creative thinking also is best when it is authentic and rooted and from the community rather than imported from someplace else.
So can you give a specific example, and you know which one I'm fishing for, about a time when that creative process has benefited a community?
Sure. So in St. Paul, we've been experiencing a huge infrastructure redevelopment, as many cities in the country are. We're building a light rail train. And of course, the hope and the expectation is that what comes along with that kind of infrastructure development is increased health and vibrancy and economic vitality for a neighborhood. The reality of living through that kind of intense construction, especially if you are a small business owner, or if that construction's happening in a neighborhood that has very real historic reasons to be worried about displacement, is that it can be incredibly challenging. And so we were experiencing this challenge firsthand in St. Paul, and so we designed this project called Irrigate, that trained artists in kind of basic community development and community organizing, artists from the neighborhoods, and then supported them to design projects that were in partnership with small businesses and neighborhood organizations. So projects that were about drawing people and attention and dollars to a place during that big construction, and projects that were also about neighborhood identity and people's sense of agency and voice during a big disruption. Over 3 years, we did 150 of those small projects. And the interesting thing about the outcome of that is that those projects added up to, they were all very small, but together they added up to this alternative, positive narrative that was about what's possible, that was about joy, that was about the identity of those places, rather than what was difficult and challenging and hard and hot about all of the construction.
That's great. Kate, let me turn to you for a second. One of the other things that I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy is, having worked in the federal government, there's a school of people who think that all communities are sort of the same, right? So we can have a national strategy, we can have a federal strategy, everything works the same place everywhere. I've also worked with a lot of people who are sort of deeply place-based in their work, organizations like Laura's, and some of them say, no, every community is unique. You can't understand our needs. You're now sitting in an organization, Bloomberg Associates, that thinks communities can learn some things from each other. So as you sort of go about, and does everyone know about Bloomberg Associates? Or can we have a word or two first about sort of what that is? And then can you just talk a little bit about how you generally take your experience working in a place like New York City and get to know a new community and figure out what's transferable, what can we learn, what's unique, that sort of stuff.
Sure, thank you. Bloomberg Associates is a consulting firm that Mike Bloomberg started after he left office. Our job is to work with mayors around the world to improve the quality of life of their citizens, and we have 8 different practice areas. One of them is culture. So I have been enormously privileged not only to get to take a shot at yet another startup, because we've been in business since January 2nd.
I was going to say Tuesday.
Exactly, right. Showed up, good, found my desk. But so far we're working with 4 different cities, and it has, as Jamie said, been fascinating to realize our mission is not to sort of be colonial and make New York grow around the world so much as to serve as experienced problem solvers, because when you've been in local government for a while, you can spot the patterns. So, that's crisis number 452, and here are 3 things you could try, and if you're lucky, it'll turn into crisis number 75, and you can just spray it with water, and it'll be better. So it's really interesting to talk to colleagues because, again, every Every form of government tends to inflect differently. It depends on leadership, depends on weak mayor, strong mayor system. You know, there are all of those kinds of variables. But what does seem to cut across in terms of the cultural constituency work that I've been doing is a set of issues around implementation. And, you know, how do you create consensus? What do the flashpoints tend to be? And they do tend, as Dennis has suggested and Laura as well, to come down to how do you give a wildly different layer of stakeholderdom, a sense of ownership, appeal, input, affect. And, you know, one of the last projects that I worked very intensively on for the city, and then it sort of has dribbled over into my afterlife a little bit, is the issues around the 9/11 memorial, the memorial itself, and then recently the opening of the museum. And, you know, so that happens to be a project with some of the most intense sets of community stakeholders who, none of whom act as a single set of people with jointly shared ideas of what it is that they're looking for. So just from a domestic personal point of view, you know, I feel pretty steeped in the respect that needs to go with a nimble view of community differential, but I'm all the more grateful to have this opportunity to see nationally and internationally that this is a dynamic that is common, but it's so powerful because when you get it right, you can see institutions that are just able to create a huge moment, set of activities, nimbus around a neighborhood that really is so different. And it's not that the bricks and mortar change. I mean, sometimes they do. But you really just start sensing this incredible opportunity. And a lot of times what it does come down to is the specific opportunity of culture is a mixing of everything, of ages, socioeconomic, race, background, interest, et cetera. So fascinating for me.
That's great, thank you. Now, Eric, you use a framing that maybe is distinct from community, maybe is overlapping, maybe is synonymous, which is citizen. And we talk about community members, we talk about citizens, we talk about being a good community member, we talk about being a good citizen. Your sort of one of your big projects at the moment is Citizens University. And how many people are familiar with Citizen University? Not a lot. So can you first just talk a little bit about that, and then I'd love to sort of follow up in talking a little bit about what makes a good citizen, and are they the same things that sort of make a good community member?
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. And actually, I want to say just at the outset, sort of in response to the joking, like, what am I doing here in the panel? I actually want to give full credit to Damien and team, because I think there's been this vision throughout, at least since I've met Damien, in the Aspen Arts program, to really have this interwoven theme of citizen as artist and artist as citizen, right? And really seeing the ways in which those two are the same and those two are distinct, and in practice and in theory. And so the work that I do in running this organization, Citizen University, is all about trying to promote the art of powerful citizenship in the United States. And when I describe citizenship, I don't mean documentation status under the immigration laws of the United States. I mean membership in community. And I think there are different ways to define community, some of which are, completely situational and contextual. It can, I'm a member of the Chinese American community. I'm a member of the Seattle community where I live right now. I'm a member of a progressive community. There are different identities there, but I think one of the things that there's an American level of this conversation that I'd just like to speak to for a moment, and then there's a city-based level too, which has just been already emerging out of my fellow panelists. On the American level, when we think about what is it that constitutes American identity, right? Citizenship, again, not as immigration status, but as membership in the American community. You think about certain aspects of our, if you want to call it, national character, to the extent that you can, put your fingers on something like that. And there are things like an innovative spirit, openness, hybridity, kind of a real interesting creative tension between individualism and kind of collective action, right? These are kind of strands woven throughout the American story, the American identity, and also this kind of sense always of constant reinvention, right? And when you think about that, these kinds of elements of our shared civic identity, you realize that every one of those things relates quite directly to the practice of art, to creative practice, as Laura was saying, right? The ability to, I don't know how many of you earlier this week got to hear, I think Nancy Andreessen is her name, the neuroscientist who was talking about the neuroscience of creativity, so much of which boils down essentially to a capacity to make unlikely associations, right? There's no better place on earth than the United States to make unlikely associations of genes, of memes, of ideas, of practices, of cultures, of norms, of mores, in theory, right? In theory. But in practice, it requires that we actually do what everybody here is talking about, which is to learn to engage each other, to learn to listen to each other in new ways, to learn not to be scared of the other, to learn how to really take a couple of new things that you've seen and try to map them to what you know. And these are what I would say the kind of nuts and bolts practices of citizenship. What it means to show up and be a pro-social contributing member of community involves all these things: how to listen, how to empathize, how to imagine connections between someone else's world and work and your own, and how from all of that to begin to imagine something new. And so that's just at the American level. But if I could just say a quick word about Seattle, where I'm based and where I'm from, you know, I think one of the things that Laura and I were joking, you know, about how I think in a good way right now, we live in an age of cities, and Bloomberg Associates is going to, you know, power that further, and Knight has, you know, had that long time as their theory of action. But one of the things that goes with being in an age of cities is cities take a lot of pride in how their cities are exceptional, and I can say that for sure in Seattle. You know, we are booming right now. We're booming economically, we're booming civically, we're booming culturally. And we're, in some ways, though, booming so much that we're worrying about what we're about to lose in this boom. And one of the things that we're going to lose, we're beginning to lose already, I hate to bring back to inequality, but is a sense of shared common cause and common story and common purpose, right? And I just think it's so vital at the level of a city that we think about how we use art every way we can to reinforce this notion that even as we start to get a little bit more stretched apart economically, even as we begin to segregate ourselves a bit more geographically as the city just gets more dense and crowded, that there are rituals, shared rituals of art making, art experience, that you have to foster and nurture to give a city this, you know, continued sense of a whole. You know, we can talk in later conversation about some of the things that we're doing in Seattle to do that.
Well, I would love that. And I was going to say, take just a minute, because I would sort of love, I love what you've just said, and I'd love to sort of understand how that works in practice, right? So Springboard decided we had to help make artists better artist citizens, and had what was in some ways a very elementary insight, which was we should introduce them, or we should explain to them how to introduce themselves to their neighbors and say, hey, I'm your neighbor, here's what I do, what are you up to, what can we do together? So it was a sort of very simple, go out and introduce yourself to someone.
I think that's, just really quickly, I think that's about developing capacity and skills for all of us to be able to do that, but it's also about permission to do it, and sort of, we talk a lot about the invitation and the charge. You need both.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. So what can you give a sort of, either through Citizens University or through Seattle or through anything else, a sort of concrete example of here's something that's worked, here's something that's made someone a more active, a more engaged citizen?
So I'll give you one that's in the Citizen University American context and one that's in Seattle. So at Citizen University, one of the things that we've tried to do is not just talk about citizenship in these kind of policy wonky political terms, but in terms of cultural experience. How many of you have ever been to a naturalization ceremony? Okay, so more than a few. Those of you who haven't, I urge you, upon going back to your homes, to find one in your town. You know, if you're in a reasonably large city, there's one going on somewhere every week in your city. And I just urge you to go to it and sit in the audience and experience it. It's one of the most powerful, moving things you can do. And I've been to a bunch of these, and it occurred to me and my colleagues at Citizen University that as moving and powerful and unique and distinctive as it is to see a group of immigrants rise during a roll call of countries as they go through, you know, where they're all from, and then be told, the next time you sit down, you will be American. Like, it's just such a powerful thing. And we'd gone through this and we thought, why can't we create something like that for everybody? Create a shared ritual and experience and ceremony for Americans of all kinds, Americans long-standing as well as brand new Americans. So we created a project that really in some ways is what I would call a civic art project called Sworn Again America. And it was created by my partner in work and life, Janae, who has a background in theater, both theater and theater education. And so she brought a theatrical sensibility to this whole thing. And what Sworn Again American does is there's a simple ceremony that we have created a template for, a script. And it involves some readings of what I would call civic scripture, whether it's from I Have a Dream or Gettysburg or the Declaration or the preamble, to the Constitution. And then there are kind of interstitial experiences that you weave in that are really dependent on who's running the ceremony. But always we encourage those interstitial experiences to be art, right? And so over the years, whether it's been the folks at Elevator Repair Service, the theater company in New York, or Tony Kushner, or the musician Paul Rucker, or the spoken word artist Hollis Wong Ware, we've had these different performers kind of weave their work, the artists weave their work into the midst of this ceremony. And then what happens after the readings is everybody rises and everybody raises their right hand and joins in this very simple, short, completely nonpartisan oath of what it means to be a citizen. And it's all oriented around service and participation and contribution and claiming. And again, it's without regard to your actual documentation status. The final words are, wherever my ancestors and I are from, I claim America, and I pledge to live like a citizen. Right? And I'll tell you what, the whole thing lasts, 7 to 15 minutes, depending on how you do it. And it is, again, moving in that way, but in a way where now it's not about we, the native-born, welcoming immigrants. It's about what are we going to learn from each other together, right?
We as a community.
We as a community. And art is woven totally into that.
I love that. Dennis, before you came into philanthropy, you had a career as an entrepreneur. And I think in that world, success is very clear. You know what's working, you know when you need to make a switch. You've now moved into philanthropy and really looking at community development through the arts as well as arts development through community and all of that. How do you know what's working? How do we know if something like the Citizen Ceremony is making a difference? How do we know if Irrigate is? How do we know?
Well, I want to give this guy a grant right now, so it's got already working.
So we know that's working. Right, exactly.
This is back a truck up for this guy and go home, all right? I'm done.
Right. Here are the 8 night communities.
Right. One of the hardest things for me was coming out of basically a startup culture, a venture capital culture, in which you have the golden rule, which is he who has the gold rules. And I went into this process and I said, well, it's just like venture capital. There's a lot of ideas that come at you. You pick 1 or 2 good ones, you fund them, and you stay with them. And then the people started coming to me, and I started looking at them, and I started telling them exactly how their project needed to be fixed. And they all told me to go jump in a lake. And I said, no, you understand, I have the money. I'm the guy with the money. And they said, we don't care. We said, we're artists. We have given up so much in our lives to be artists that we're not going to let some guy with money come to us and tell us how to do our project, how to connect with our community, how to be part of our neighborhood. And luckily that epiphany moment happened for me very early in the process. Otherwise I either might not be here or I might have just gotten lost in some way. So you have to understand that what artists have given up to be artists, in many cases, obviously, Laura's spent a lot of her time trying to figure out how to get them health care, how to bring them together as a culture. And so for me, that was the moment that I understood that it's a different culture of being willing to give up so many different things in order to make art, And when you look at a successful artist, and there are some here this week that I spent some time with, and I said, boy, the greatest opportunity you get as an artist is simply the right to make work. And in your community, we have to tap into that. We have to find a way to tap into that, to invite artists to feel like they have that seat at the table that Laura always talks about. I just want to touch on the thing about calling yourself an artist. The thing I struggle with there is that a lot of you are golfers and tennis players, or you call yourself golfers and tennis players, and I've seen you play. Okay. Whereas you may sing in the choir, you may make a quilt, those kind of things. So don't be afraid to say I am an artist, because we're never going to break down those barriers if we don't all acknowledge that we're kind of within the same circle. So it's something we really have to work on. It's like invite an artist to a meeting, not because it's this other idea, but invite them to a meeting because they will give you solutions and take you places that you wouldn't go otherwise. And that I have found that to be maybe the joy of the job has been that,
And just one follow-up question. You guys at Knight have done, I think, a really extraordinary job of making artists, of making citizens, of making community members feel welcome into the conversation, because you have a very specific way of inviting applications. Will you just say a word about sort of the way you guys do that?
Sure. The other thing I learned very quickly is, you won't believe this, but the best art ideas don't necessarily come from 501c3s. It took me a while to figure that out. So when we have basically an open call in a number of our communities, and we say to people, anybody, you can be a 501c3, you can be an individual artist, you can be a small collective, you can be a corporation. We funded corporations. And we've simply said with the Knight Arts Challenge, give us your best art idea. There are only 3 rules. Your idea must be about art, it must take place in or benefit your community, and we actually ask the community to help match the funding that we give. But the invitation is to everybody, and nobody believes us in the beginning. And then we announced the first set of winners like we did in Detroit last October. And people were like, well, wait a second, I know that guy. If he could get a grant, I could get a grant. I have an idea for a project too. So the pure democratic invitation is what creates energy in community. It isn't even the winners that are so important in this process. It's the idea that somebody made an application, you announce the winners, they don't always say, I didn't win, but I was in that contest. Or the pure opportunity to the community knowing that it's democratic. Now, sometimes you have to go, and I used to make wine, and the way you sell wine is like this. You walk in with a bottle of wine and you try to hand sell it. And sometimes with cultural opportunities, you can't forget that you've got to go to certain neighborhoods and you've got to say, this is for you too, And that's a hard thing to do sometimes, because you can easily fall back and say, well, I invited everybody. The fact that those guys over there didn't come, that's not my fault. Can't work that way. You've got to go community by community. We call neighborhood by neighborhood. Thank you. Neighborhood by neighborhood, and say this is for your neighborhood too. Just one quick example. We had a couple of years ago. We had a winner of the Knight Arts Challenge. The drummer who used to play for Third World, which was a great reggae band back in the 80s. He won the Knight Arts Challenge. First Jamaican winner we've ever had in Miami. The Jamaican community, you would have thought he won the Nobel Prize. I mean, they went crazy. But the only way it got done is I met him and I said, you've got to apply for this. You've got to do it. And so you can't lose sight. We can talk about democracy as, letting everybody attend. There's a difference between letting everybody attend and making sure everybody feels welcome. And that's a hard thing to achieve. That's been one of the hardest things I've tried to get traction on in my time, at Knight with community.
I think that's great. Kate, let me turn back to that question of how do you know what's working? You're now in your 13th year of working for a guy who's been known both in business and I think in government for wanting to know what's working and wanting you to be able to prove it. And what has that meant for you, sort of, particularly in city government where you're working on behalf of a community and you're working sort of specifically with the cultural sector, which we all know loves to be measured and loves data, right? It's our favorite thing.
I'm looking at Thelma and Lisa. Hi, guys. A number of different ways. I mean, I think in terms of city government, you're not spending private philanthropic dollars, you're spending tax levy dollars. So our threshold for funding was community service. And so there were a number of art activities that were extraordinary taking place, but because they weren't going to have a major public payoff, whether it was a viewing or the price point was too high or whatever, city government turned out to not be the right partner for them. But a lot of what we tried to do, and in some ways it was most evident in our capital budget, was make places as accessible as possible, literally, physically, trying to create a dynamic where people felt welcome. So part of it really was the screen of what kind of public service is this providing, and we would quantify it in all different kinds of ways. X percentage of our funding pool were providing essentially human services that reached certain kinds of in-need populations. The key thing that I have always tried to stay away from is making attendance the key metric of value, because the way in which arts and culture sits very uncomfortably in a government context is that the bottom line isn't the bottom line. And we have seen over and over again in the world of arts and culture, an example I like to use is Merce Cunningham, who was probably more influential than any other single artist in a variety of disciplines, everything from leotard design to contemporary music, much less choreography. But, honestly, not wildly popular in terms of attendance value. But so community engagement metric breaking down by different types of audiences served. And, we had to spend a certain amount of dwell time in economic impact because it's there and it's measurable. But we always tried to figure out how to move beyond it or how to strike the chord of collaboration. Because I do think as a strategy, arts and culture, and particularly nonprofit, but also for-profit as well, has some of the highest rate of success at being able to pull in other kind of sectors, whether it's housing or various kinds of things that are more often deemed as entertainment or education than other kinds of areas. And the one, I just want to take a minute to also speak to failure. The one kind of research project I would still love to make successful, but never figured out how to, is to do a cultural version of a criminological long-term study that's taken place in Chicago that measures something called collective efficacy. And what it looks at is it's different sets of neighborhoods that are equally socioeconomically stressed. But what this study tended to look at is that in one neighborhood, there were geraniums in the window box and everybody was civil and the grandmothers could sit out on the stoop and say hello to everyone. And in the other neighborhood, people felt completely under assault, totally barricaded, no kind of communication happening on the streets. And what this study was trying to look at, again, from a criminological perspective, is what were the factors that made one community, neighborhood, street, feel as if it could function as a whole, and what factors were absent from the other. And the conclusions ultimately came down to certain kind of value sets, but really individuals. Mm-hmm. And that I think is the other potential that arts organizations have, is to some extent they can speak over and around and beyond the clutter of abstraction. Buy this product, have this experience. It's almost always in the abstract. What culture can reach beyond and create a very personal connection to is whether it's a facility or a set of programs, and activating that. I would love to figure out how to measure that on behalf of culture as a function of creating community.
That's really interesting. And in the Charles Montgomery book that I'm reading, one of his proxies for how you measure how happy a community is you poll the residents and ask them, if you were to lose your wallet on the street, how likely is it that you'd get it back? And the answer, the more likely you thought you were to get your wallet back, the happier you were. And that perception had nothing to do with reality. So it had nothing to do with the reality of crime. But anyway, Laura, let me just turn to you for a moment. You're sort of here sitting within an arts organization. I think there are many kinds of definitions for what Springboard is. And I think both Laura and I sometimes speak about arts organizations the way we would speak about our family. We love them, but we also hate them in the right ways at the right times. And no one else can pick on them. And one of the questions that sort of comes up is, should every arts organization be involved with building community? Should they not? Is building audience the same thing as building community? I mean, so sort of talk about that role of arts organization as citizen, as neighbor, as community member. Is it synonymous with audience? Is it not? How do those things intersect and play with each other?
No, it's not synonymous with audience.
That's a hard question, by the way. I'm glad he asked you that.
I'm trying to be diplomatic.
I give her money. I can ask her the hard questions.
Well, just be really candid. I mean, I think that we are in a place culturally right now where art and cultural experience are fundamental and relevant in people's everyday lives, and arts organizations, many of them, are not. And the way that we have pulled apart the sort of everyday art and creativity of people's lives and the kind of professionalization of art and culture in big institutions that often are not really connected to the daily lives of the people who are in the community in which those institutions sit, because the community around those institutions has changed a lot while they were busy, you know, developing a subset of that community as their audience. So I am loath to tell other organizations what they should be doing, but I do think if they're interested in their long-term relevance, then they probably need to be understanding more about who actually lives in their community and what they want from their arts and culture experience, and how they might learn from and engage with the community around them. I think that impulse has come from a good place. We've had this sort of quest for validation in the arts, and we want people to, you know, for an artist, it's very important that someone says you're an artist. And so we've sort of made that a very specialized thing that's over here on the side and no one else can do it. And to Dennis's point, I think if we invite more people to acknowledge the art in their own lives, the creativity in their own lives, their own creative impulse, that's more is more. I mean, the analogy I like to make, like you said about golfers and tennis players and people who run, are allowed to call themselves athletes, right? We don't get worried that they're going to get confused and come to the Olympics.
Although Dennis is an award-winning putter. We didn't find out.
Thank you for that.
Deborah, so where's his award? Do we know where his putting award is?
I think actually, you know, recognizing yourself as an artist gives you even more appreciation for the work and the practice and the guts and the dedication that it takes to work at a professional level. So I'm not worried about that at all. And I think that's the only path where the current infrastructure we have for arts and culture will still exist in the next 10 years even, I think. To this point about measurement, I just want to address that really quick because I think that's another piece of this, is figuring out how we measure this in a really practical way and in a way that that not only is sort of tangible, but also makes a kind of logical sense and makes sense to people. And I think there are ways to do that. I mean, there's great research from the Wilder Foundation around social capital and how that actually improves community and individual health. I mean, very practical things like lower rates of obesity and diabetes when you feel connected to your neighbors. So that, I mean, that project that Eric described, that is a way of building social capital and increasing the health of the community. In the Irrigate project, we talked about one of the big challenges of huge community disruption is there's this really negative media narrative that gets repeated over and over again. It's so difficult to get to these businesses, we can't get there, the parking is terrible. And those projects that the artists did we were able to measure that they generated 30 million positive media impressions in a time when there were very few positive media stories.
And so it made it a cool place to be, which was almost impossible to do on a construction site.
And a place that represented the people who actually lived there. So rather than a city hiring a marketing department to put up a bunch of billboards saying, please come patronize these local businesses, we know the parking is terrible, but you should do it anyway. These were projects that were of the community, that were these moments of joy and surprise and identity and reasons to go there. Which is, you know, that's the piece that's so compelling about what Kate was saying. That's the broken windows theory in reverse, right? If we give people these moments and signals that people care for their place, that they're tending it, that they're providing opportunities to do fun, interesting things, then that gives us a different sense of our own agency and our own ability to just do something in service of our place.
And the other just to pile on, the other thing that's so important about that approach is, And you know, thank you for picking off the scab about the relationship of arts organizations to participating in creativity and the whole conversation about amateur versus professional, which is, you know, an urgent one. But one of the most interesting pieces of research I read about this issue around participation in New York was a study done by the theater community that looked at why there wasn't more visitation even when price points were adjusted to mainstream Broadway shows. And there were a couple of key things. One was that theater had gotten to the point where almost all ticket purchases required a credit card, which not everybody has, and you know, it was very difficult to do a point of purchase with cash. And the second thing was that the actual gating procedures for theater had become completely unfamiliar to huge numbers of people, which is to say, if your main experience of ticketed entertainment is a movie theater, going someplace where you have a seat assignment and somebody either takes your thing away from you and zaps it or rips it or does something to it and then launches you into an auditorium where you don't understand the social protocol of getting seated, you know, and particularly if you're an adult bringing a child, it can feel extraordinarily humiliating. It's not at all welcoming. But, you know, good for that sector for really taking a hard look at its gating procedures. It's something that not enough institutions tend to do, and that's because it is so hard and often so challenging to create a space in which you're living in a, you know, sort of nonlinear art-making kind of environment. You know, administrators figure, Diana, it's enough. Like, you should just come to me because I put out all this effort, when in fact it's most urgent to then make the next step and figure out who your audience is, how you attract them. Again, different from community, but it has that same dynamic of, you know, understanding what it is that you're trying to do and do it intentionally.
So I think, you know, Kate was just speaking about sort of building barriers to participation. So we're going to open this up to all of you in a minute, and we've decided to build a barrier to your participation, which is we're going to ask you to line up behind this wired mic. So that's perhaps the most welcoming way we could invite questions. So I'm going to, wasn't that nice of us? We can sort of see it in practice. I'm going to ask Eric a question, then we're going to turn to this mic, and whoever is there gets to ask whatever they want. Eric, a lot of us were yesterday at Secretary Clinton's comments, and one of the many applause lines was her defense of compromise and how important that is to governing. And I would guess that compromise is also important to community and to citizenship. And how do you sort of learn to live with people you disagree with? How do you learn to sort of do when we agree enough? So are you guys addressing that notion of compromise and how we learn to sort of do that as part of what the university is doing?
We are, absolutely. I mean, I think for those of you who missed Secretary Clinton's remarks, really one of her big applause lines was when she was talking about the idea that if you are a candidate for office and your stance is, I'm 100% dedicated to my principles and beliefs, and I will not compromise when I get elected, her view was that that should automatically be disqualifying to have that point of view. And I would say we in our work try to do that a few different ways. One is actually just outright creating new spaces where we can incubate cross-partisan problem solving. And so we've done work where we've brought together Grover Norquist, who's here at Ideas Festival, from the hard right, the anti-tax small government right, Joan Blades, co-founder of MoveOn.org from the very activist progressive left, and created spaces where they can not only A, get to actually know one another, but B, think about what are some issues where it's different from compromise. It's not split the difference, let's find something in the middle compromise. It's, is there a way in which each of our value sets actually can touch and have slight Venn overlap? And it turns out there are a few issues where this is the case. One is criminal justice reform, right? So it turns out that the small government right and the social justice left quite agree that our prison industrial complex is out of control, and that our criminal sentencing regime is out of control, and that these things have to be reformed. They increasingly quite agree that immigration reform is necessary, right? So there are situations like that as I think about it, even as I describe it, you might be thinking, well, where's the art in that, right? And it kind of comes to a thing that both Kate and Laura were making me think here, which is the word integration kept popping into my mind. And one thing that I realized is when you're talking about measurements and the social capital measurements, so there's this great thing that's been in existence for the last couple of years called the Civic Health Index. that the National Conference on Citizenship and a few different organizations around the country have developed, and it's a real set of metrics that measure things like volunteering, voting, participation, but also neighborliness and the rest, that measure the civic health of Miami or Minneapolis or Seattle or New York. And it occurred to me as we were talking here that there is nothing in the Civic Health Index that speaks to arts, creativity, and culture. And that's insane, right? That's and so one of the things that I think we have to do if we want to cultivate civically healthy communities where there is a spirit of empathy and therefore a possibility of compromise, then the thing you got to measure is to what extent is there art and culture in that city so that people develop some of these habits that Laura was talking about.
Social capital. Yeah. I think that's great. All right, so we're going to move to the lightning round at the microphone. Robert, kick us off.
I'm Robert Lehrman. I'm a member of the Hirshhorn Board in Washington, D.C., and I participate on a Lehrman Foundation that gives to the arts, among other civic endeavors. I love and admire every one of you up there, but I desperately need for you to do better for me and for us. There are less than 50 people in this room, and I want to ask you all, following up on the notion of Civic Health Index, and bear with me.
Yeah.
The Washington Project for the Arts in D.C. went into a fringe neighborhood, created a beachhead economic revival followed. We know the same thing happened in New York and Soho. Catholic University has just created the largest Main Street addition to Washington, D.C., and it was built on a main street with artistic participation at the end. The economic data that we get from the People for the American Way communicates the additional cost, and you were talking about the Wilder Foundation measures social capital. We have all these benchmarks. One is commercial, one is economic. And then the last philosophical one, offered by Billingsley, the Librarian of Congress, says that having visual literacy, including art, and reading literacy prepares our citizens to be more educated to deal with a more complex world. We have all these metrics, and yet I beg you to tell us how to quantify these metrics. So instead of talking to 43 people, you're talking to 143, and we can talk to 1,000 and 10,000. Because what I hear is experiential. I know Dennis with the Knight Foundation, and I don't know how, has had metrics, but I'm not hearing them in a way that I've drunk the Kool-Aid, I give, I get. Tell us, how do we coordinate what you're saying into an intelligible data basis, or build one if it doesn't exist?
So I think we probably all agree with that charge 100%. Does anyone want to react quickly to that?
I guess I would say that it is about metrics, certainly, but it is also about building those relationships in our community. I think for a very, so I'm going to just stake out some territory of criticizing arts organizations today. For a long time in the arts sector, we've actually done a very good job of advocating for our value and sort of using economic impact arguments, lobbying for federal money, that kind of thing, but we haven't actually done a great job of building real relationships in our community across sectors with neighborhood development organizations, CDCs, city governments, and having, so it's both. I think it's metrics, but it's also having our own social capital in the neighborhoods, in communities where people have the opportunity to have that experiential relationship to it.
Can I just speak to that? I really agree with that, and I think there's a proper, great place for metrics. But one thing that strikes me, if our goal is to make this 10, 100x the turnout at events like this, and the propagating value of this, relationships absolutely. But also, I would encourage us all, artists or not, by profession, to think like politicians. Right, and by this I mean
think like good politicians.
Well, no, actually, good and bad politicians do the following things. They do the following thing. They think about constituencies. They think about who within a constituency, whether you want to call it ethnic or neighborhood or whatever, are the key nodes of networks who you have to work and build a relationship with and get their trust so that they'll vouch for you. You think about who you understand power. You know how to read the power map of a community and a neighborhood to understand where you got to steer clear and where you want to pour it on. You think about how 4 different kinds of communities, constituencies, and audiences, you are going to emphasize different parts of your message. You're not just going to be a robot and say the same 10 words to everybody, right? Good retail politicians do this in ways that I'm not exactly sure are quantifiable or subject to great data. The genius of Bill Clinton as a reader of room and as a reader of political maps, you can't be so easily put into numbers, but that's the kind of thing that every one of us who care about the arts and care about arts and culture should be thinking more like, and thinking not just like, how do I market or how do I notify people, but how do I really work a community and figure out what is their motivation, what is their self-interest, what's making them mad, happy, scared, or sad, and how can I tap into that? And that's just not something that people in the arts are as accustomed to doing.
I think that's right. So let me make an offer to Aspen, which I think I can speak for all 5 of us. We not only would be happy to come back for any arts track panels, but we're also happy to come back for any non-arts track panels. So we're happy to come back and talk in any other sector and talk about that. Deborah, hi.
Hi. I have a question for you about...
Just say a word about who you are.
I will. First I'll say my question, then I'll say... I have a question for you about size of community. My name is Deb Fallows, and my husband Jim Fallows, who writes for The Atlantic, and I have spent the last year going around the country visiting small towns that are revitalizing themselves, rebuilding themselves in some ways, towns of 1,200, 10,000, 40,000. And one of the things that has struck us most is how vital the arts communities are in towns that are rebuilding themselves economically. Just one quick example, town of 1,200 people, Eastport, Maine. We happened to be there when they were doing a production of The Glass Menagerie. This is a town of 1,200 people. So we went that night. It was in a rebuilt community center. The ticket taker was also the newspaper editor. The stage production person was also the barista in town. All the kids in the school were invited to come for free. Everybody was there. Tickets were $10. And this is a very small size example of something that's working really well in smaller size communities. So I wonder if you might speak to some of the many issues that are most important in why things can either work or not work in small communities, and what big cities, like you've been talking about, might learn from the smaller communities.
So I'll just speak really quickly, because it's wonderful that you mentioned Eastport, Maine, which just last week received its 2nd investment from Art Place America, because we recognized exactly what was happening, and that this is a town, if you don't know it, is on the very edge of the United States. I mean, it's, I think, a 2-hour drive from Bar Harbor. It's 2 hours from St. John's, New Brunswick. You know, it's very isolated. And after, one of the community drivers is the Quoddy Tides museum that's there. It's run by an extraordinary man. And with the work they've been doing, and talking about sort of relevant metrics, small cruise ships have begun coming back to Eastport. They just opened up a new candy store in the middle of the downtown Main Street. So new businesses are coming, and it's a community of, is it 3,000, 1,200? 1,200 people sort of have new businesses opening, cruise ships coming back. It's really extraordinary. Let me just ask our last 2 people at the mic, come forward, say your things, and then we'll do closing thoughts, because I know we're right towards the end of this. So.
Well, Dennis, you opened with talking about how important aesthetics are to attracting people to a community, and that has just had my mind churning about public art. And Laura, I know that St. Paul has a really awesome public arts organization. I'm from Fargo, North Dakota.
Excellent.
And yeah.
Which also just received an Art Place grant for a community garden.
Yes.
That's being designed by an artist, an
yes.
extraordinary earthworks artist.
Yeah, so we have lots of different organizations, a private development firm, that's doing some different things in public art. The government just started a public arts task force. The private foundation that I work for has an arts focus. But how do we bring these Aspen ideas back to our communities and create those really vibrant, beautiful communities by uniting those public and private sectors?
Excellent. Let me just put a thumbtack in that, get the last question, then we'll do closing thoughts.
Okay. I guess as we have been in several days of discussions about inequality and poverty and so on, anything that arts sounds a little bit like a discussion of cake, circus, and arts. And I would, like to know how each of you are defining arts. And I've not only drunk the Kool-Aid, I've helped make the Kool-Aid in both the arts and the technology side of things. So I have a lot of right brain, left brain proclivities. But in making the argument now, one thing that strikes me, and you've all touched on it a little bit, But there are so many things that now we are discovering about the human brain. And for example, here, there's Alive Inside was playing during the health thing. I'm also involved in one called High Notes, and it's about the unbelievable impact of music in both people with Alzheimer's and dementia, but also in rehab. And there's so many dimensions to the arts that can be brought into things that are a different kind of metrics. The health metrics are others. So Great. Back to that first gentleman, one, I'd like that, and two, I'd like to hear each definition of the arts.
Excellent. And Philip, did you want to get in with a last thought?
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, I was thinking of the old WPA guides to cities and states, and how remarkably they actually included the arts in their narrative account of cities. And so you can do a show of hands. How many of you could provide to me like a good narrative, holistic account of the arts in your city? Really?
I'll do it. All right, so I know we're just a little bit over time, so I'll give each of you 30 seconds to explain what is art, why is it important, and how do we fill the room. My former boss, so no pressure.
So I'm going to be non-compliant and hold off on the what is art, because everybody else here can do that better. But Philip, take a look, if you haven't already, at something called the World Cities Cultural Report, because it's an effort by World Cities to create a cultural narrative for each of them. And it's not perfect, but I think it's a really good start towards doing that and towards recognizing how important it is. To the question of, let them eat cake, I think, the arts, and largely driven by competition among arts organizations, and I blame the romantics for the myth of artist as lone genius, but the perception and positioning of the arts as a sector has been absolutely dreadful for decades. And I'm joining Laura in the self-immolation squad over here, but I think everybody who is part of this constituency needs to help us help them. And the key breakthrough I think we're starting to hear, and honestly I credit Damien's leadership through Aspen for a lot of this, is that the arts represent a series of strategies that are enormously effective. And when you're dealing with things like income inequality, a group of organizations and impulses and gifts that can really give people a sense of community ownership, give them a sense of their own abundance, could not be more meaningful and more urgent to develop. And I do think public art is a crucial part of that strategy.
Excellent. Laura, perfect 15-second soundbite.
The definition of art that we like at Springboard is the way that the artist Alan Capro talked about it. He defined art as the weaving of meaning making in our everyday lives. So how do we make meaning out of our everyday lives? And I think if you look around the festival at the conversations around inequality, around healthcare, around community development, around globalization, if these aren't challenges that need creative thinking, then I don't know what are. If these aren't the challenges that need citizen artists and artist citizens, then I don't know what are. And I think that it's time that we as a sector, as artists, step up, and I think that demands reaching out and building relationships.
Let me tell you about a real place that embodies maybe answers to all these questions. A place in Seattle called HIDMO, H-I-D-M-O, which just started informally and then took on semi-institutional life as a place where members of the various immigrant communities came together first to socialize, millennials, many of them, first to socialize, but then to make art, and then to spread their art around the community and the city. And now it's sort of the epicenter of a revival of a whole part of town and a gateway for the making of meaning, not only by these individuals who haven't previously had voice in our community, but the making of meaning in our city about what kind of city we are in Seattle.
Great. Dennis, the last thing to send everyone home.
I'm normally the cranky guy. I'm not feeling very cranky today, I guess. I don't know why that is, but Philip's cranky, and so he's doing it for me, which is good. Go home, reach out to your mayor, tell them what you want, because mayors are on board with this right now. The mayors have figured out that cultural activity in your community is the biggest bargain there is. That all the money they used to pay to move a factory from 2 counties over to here, that money's gone, okay? But cultural money that creates vibrancy in your community, in neighborhoods, they're starting to figure it out. It's amazing to watch, really led by some of the things that Kate has done. These guys are out there doing it every day. Go home and tell your mayor what you want, because he's listening right now.
I think that's great. Please join me in thanking our panel.